Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
It wasn't a prominent feature of the Brexit debate in the run-up to the referendum. Most of us had probably never heard of it before this week, yet Britain's membership of EURATOM, the EU-wide agency that governs the transportation of radioactive materials needed in nuclear energy research and medicine, has become one of the first major tests for the government's plans for EU withdrawal, certainly among MPs. So let's talk to our assistant political editor, Norman Smith. What's it all about, Norman?
Well, it's about basically one of Mrs May's key red lines, namely getting out of the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, because EURATOM, this European regulator, comes under the jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice. Now, as we know, Mrs May has said very, very clearly, part of Brexit is ensuring that it is British courts that decide, and for that reason, she believes we have to leave EURATOM and set up our own agency, which would come under the authority of British courts. Now, why this matters is because, one, there are all sorts of potential practical implications in terms of the nuclear industry in Britain, in terms of retaining jobs here, but above all, concerns about what the impact might be on the import of medical isotopes used for scans and treatment in cancer medicine. And the fear is that if we leave, that could be compromised. So the question is how far Mrs May is prepared to take those risks in order to stick by her red line of ending the authority of the European Court of Justice.
Does she face a potential rebellion on her own backbenches on this issue?
She absolutely does. I mean, there was a debate in Westminster Hall yesterday, and I was struck by the range and number of Tory MPs who have deep, deep worries about what this is going to mean. And interestingly, even some Eurosceptics, Sir Bill Cash, saying, look, we're going to have to find a solution to this, because this is a problem that is going to crop up again and again and again. Take, for example, the issue of EU nationals. Who is going to actually enforce their rights? Again, is it going to be the European Court or is it going to be British courts? And that sort of conflict is going to come up repeatedly. His suggestion was you should come up with some sort of tribunal system where you had British judges sitting alongside European judges. But this sort of tension, trying to resolve which court has authority, is going to be central to the sort of whole Brexit process. And we're now seeing the sharp end of it with the debate over EURATOM.
It's quite a good example, is it not, Norman, of something that's never been high profile, but is incredibly complicated to resolve, whichever way we go, and incredibly complicated within the timetable, because the Article 50 deal, although it doesn't get implemented if it's done until March 2019, it'll have to be agreed around November of 2018 for ratification. And it's quite hard, they must be thinking in Whitehall, to get all this done by then.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is absolutely spot on. What is interesting is we've just had the government's position paper on EURATOM, and what they're basically proposing is a transitional phase. And it seems to me Brexit is now moving into transition time, because all these sort of difficulties are piling up. And as Mr Barnier said yesterday, the clock is ticking, and boy is it ticking, because he basically wants this sorted by the autumn of next year. We've got this great hulking repeal bill about to be published, all sorts of problems and difficulties ahead on that, if it can be passed at all. And then queuing up behind that, you've got 7 other bits of Brexit legislation, and frankly, almost no one believes it's going to be possible to do in that time frame. So the only way the government can do it is to buy themselves some time. How do you do that? You start talking about a transitional period. The difficulty, if you talk about a transitional period, it's like sort of just throwing a match into the Tory backbenches. It'll just go woof, because Tory backbenchers take the view, if you're talking transition, you're basically maybe just trying to scupper Brexit by talking ever and ever further off before we eventually leave. In effect, a bit like the CBI, talking about this unending process of transition. But that, it seems to me, is what the government is going to have to be forced down if it's to get any of this through.
Thank you for that, Norman. Fascinating stuff. Transition, transition, transition. I think you're going to hear a lot more of that in the months ahead. David Jones is still with us. We're also joined by Conservative MP Ed Vaizey. Welcome to you, Ed Vaizey, as well. Now, David Jones, the Royal College of Radiologists is warning today that leaving EURATOM would impact on the supply of radioisotopes, which is very important in medicine. The chief executive of the Nuclear Industry Association said yesterday the transportation of medical isotopes could be affected because of the EURATOM Treaty governs the trade in these materials. Are they right?
It certainly does. And of course, what we have to do is to put our own arrangements in place to replace that. But I think what we're overlooking is the fact that we had no option but to leave the EURATOM Treaty, because the EURATOM Treaty was so closely bound up with the EU treaties legally that giving notice under Article 50 to leave the EU treaties also had the effect of leaving EURATOM. So what we're now doing is putting in place a bill. There'll be a nuclear safeguards bill coming through in this session of Parliament.
And you do all that in this time?
Well, I believe that we have no option but to do so.
What do you say to transition, transition, transition?
I think that there will have to be an implementation period. I think.
You say implement. I say transition.
Well, we
implement implies you've agreed it all, but you can't just do it all in time. That's a different word. Transition implies that there will remain things that have to be resolved through over a period of time after March 2019. That's a different thing.
That's a fair comment, but what we will seek to do is to come to the agreement with the EU in the negotiations that are going on at the moment, and then put in place the implementation period.
Okay. Ed Vaizey, at Prime Minister's question yesterday, Damien Green, who took it, he accused you and your colleagues of scaremongering, saying, because you're saying that EURATOM would present a risk to the treatment of cancer patients. Are you scaremongering? Brexit causes cancer. Is that the new claim?
No, certainly not. I mean, I didn't know the lady who heads the Royal College of Radiologists. I was actually on a programme with her this morning. It's the first time I'd met her. I was rung up by a newspaper asking for a quote about this, and I said, absolutely not. I'm not going to give you a quote about isotopes because I don't know about this issue. I come at it because I have next door to my constituency something called the Joint European Torus, which is a nuclear research facility. That's where I come from. But actually, when I met this lady this morning, she showed me the line in the treaty that says that medical isotopes are covered. It's a tariff issue, I gather. It's basically a free trade area for medical isotopes. And she's concerned. So she's raised these concerns and she wants answers from the government. But as I say, I come at it from the European research angle, where Britain has led the way and received hundreds of millions of pounds worth of investment and created hundreds, if not thousands, of jobs on the back of it.
But the Prime Minister included the UK's intention to leave EURATOM in her Article 50 letter back in March. Seems a long while ago now,
it
doesn't it? Nothing much has happened, of course, since then. It's not that I can think of, but anyway, it was back in March. Didn't they see this coming? Is it too late to reverse that policy?
We did see it coming, and I raised it during the Article 50 debates, but the clear message from the government, and I supported them on this, was that you couldn't exercise Article 50 without coming out of the EURATOM. It had to be a clean Article 50, if you like, and if they tried it, they say that they would have been subject to legal action. We could have ended up in the European Court of Justice for months on end. Having said that, none of us have seen this legal advice or even a précis of this legal advice, and there are plenty of people who say the opposite. But you're right, we are where we are and we need to find a way forward. I think what is coming out, particularly coming out in your discussion with David, is two things. One is, please let's not be so ideological about Brexit that anything with the word European is bad. If it means that we sustain trade or aviation, like Michael O'Leary raised yesterday, and it means Ryanair, that the European Court of Justice has a role, please not just say, well, we can't have that because it's got the word Europe in it. And secondly, this point about transition, and David raised transition in the debate yesterday, and I intervened on him to get clarity. Don't be frightened of transition. Don't think that transition is a Trojan horse to stop Brexit. Think of transition as making sure that we get a Brexit that doesn't unnecessarily cost jobs and investment in this country.
Are you prepared to accept that?
Well, I think that that's very fair. And indeed, as you mentioned, Bill Cash actually yesterday came up with some suggestions which I think were very sensible. For example, you could have a joint panel of British and EU judges. And in fact, there are precedents for this. For example, the Canadian EU Free Trade Treaty that was concluded very recently makes arrangement for a panel of three, including one from either side and an independent.
You might need quite a lot of judges. You'll probably end up with another joint judge panel on EU citizens' rights.
Well, it's probably a growth industry, but...
I mean, if Labour gets its fundamental right, I mean, the legal profession is going to be the fastest growing profession in Britain at this rate.
Speaking as a lawyer, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, I knew you had a vested interest. I just knew you had a vested interest.
There might be 3 lawyers on
Three lawyers on the table.
I'm staying strategically quiet.
You just see this as a dripping roast, don't you? Even the Vote Leave campaign director, Dominic Cummings, tweeted this week that, quote, the Tory party keeps making huge misjudgments over what the referendum was about and claims the role of the European Court is not a significant problem. That's Dominic Cummings.
Well, yes, I read what he said, but I think we have to recognise, and I think both Britain and the EU recognise, that to leave the EU also means that you leave EURATOM. What we need to do now is to make sure, as you say, that we have arrangements, implementation or transitional arrangements, coupled, of course, with a dispute resolution system, which is acceptable, and it's not beyond the wit of man.
You following this all right? It's quite complicated, isn't it?
Conclusions I would draw. First of all, our negotiating strategy is a mess. Secondly, the prior decision by Theresa May that the European Court of Justice would have no justiciability and no further relevance after Article 50 was concluded has had a whole series of consequences that weren't fully anticipated at the time. Don't take my word for it, take David Davis's word for it. He was as surprised as anybody that a red line was drawn on the ECJ. And thirdly, I'd really echo the point that Ed made, which is, frankly, whether it is the European arrest warrant, whether it is EURATOM, there are common sense solutions that can emerge, but our intention with a dogmatic approach that says the ECJ is an absolute red line. And ironically, exactly as you suggest, Andrew, one of the consequences, if the ECJ gives way to a growth industry of new regulatory bodies and judicial oversight, will be vastly more bureaucracy, work, regulatory bodies and work for lawyers in Britain, hardly the deregulatory initiative that many Brexiteers were hoping for.
The suggestion is that the Prime Minister was being dogmatic, but that's not the case. The fact is that Article 50 itself provides that as soon as the 2 years have expired, we cease to be subject to the European treaties. Part of being subject to the EU treaties is being subject to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. So what we have to do now is to put in place new arrangements for resolving disputes as the one that we're discussing.
But do you
now.
honestly believe all this can be done by March 2019?
I believe it can, if there's sufficient will. But in any event, as we've just discussed, there's probably going to have to be a period after that where these matters
Let me make one point. When you say
resolved.
sufficient will, I agree with you, but there's a peculiarly British conceit to this conversation, which is that we get to decide
Exactly.
whether we're in
No,
EURATOM or not,
I
whether we have the
I'd
will or
agree
whether
with
we
that.
don't. The truth is we've got 27 other sovereign governments that are going to decide
Okay.
what the
That's
deal now
absolutely
looks like.
right.
The realpolitik of this, I would suggest, is that the Prime Minister is not in a strong position. She's in a weak position, even with her own party. She's in a weak position. And that she could well have to give away on this. Isn't that the case?
Well, I think a lot of this stems from the rhetoric that happened before the election, and this no deal is better than a bad deal, and we're going to go out and trade with the world. I mean, obviously, I love Britain to trade with the world, but this idea that we're going to spring fully formed after leaving the European Union into this and everything's going to be fine is clearly not the case. It's going to be hard-pounding and difficult work. And what I yearned for from the Prime Minister before the election, and I hope she will do now, is to reach out to people who are very nervous about leaving the European Union, accept that we have voted for Brexit, but there are complex issues, and you can't simply pretend that it's all going to be sorted by March 2019, that there won't be some mess and some fuzziness around the edges, and you've got to, I think, dial down the rhetoric. So that's where I think the new position should change the way the Prime Minister approaches this.
So that may be what she has to do.
I've been getting